Hey, Professor here. Welcome to my updated guide on the Holy Paladin for the pre-Battle for Azeroth patch. What I'd like to do with this guide is first go over talents, second go over gear and legendaries, third go over add-ons, keybinds, and macros, and lastly go over playstyle and abilities. And so hopefully this guide will be comprehensive but also efficient. I don't want to have this guide go on forever. So let's jump right into it. The talents are a little bit different, and we need to discuss the changes, but I will pretend like you have not seen my previous guide, so we'll kind of briefly go over everything. Here are the other talents if you are interested. Notice how the first row did not really change. Crusader's Might, you're going to go for damage. It pretty much allows your Crusader Strike to reduce the cooldown of your Holy Shock, so you can go back to back Crusader Strike, Holy Shock. You can do a ton of damage. It really increases your usage of Holy Shock, which will increase your damage output. This only really works in melee range, right? Because your Crusader Strike is a melee ability. So whenever you can take advantage of that, definitely do that. I tend to roll with Bestow Faith for the most part. I do enjoy this. I usually use this on myself. I just like throwing it on myself when I know I'm taking damage. You know, it's really easy to predict damage on yourself because you can do Light of the Martyr, stuff like that. You kind of know when you're taking damage, so you just throw that on yourself and then maybe throw out some Light of the Martyrs, and then you can get healed by that 5 seconds later. Light's Hammer is an ability where it does do some damage, but I would say I would mainly use this for an AoE heal. I might take this for a fight where we are all stacked up, and I can really benefit from that Light's Hammer. It's on a 1-minute cooldown, so definitely some use on that, but I would roll Bestow Faith most of the time. Second row, Unbreakable Spirit, definitely some good defensive abilities, cooldown reduction here. I tend to run with Cavalier for mobility though, and I usually run with Rule of Law when I don't need the mobility. Rule of Law is amazing. Cavalier just gives you an extra charge of your Divine Steed, allows you to get around quicker. Rule of Law really allows you to get those heals far out on a fight where people are going out of your range or PvP. The range is amazing, and then obviously it increases your healing just a little bit too because it increases the reach of your mastery. And remember, your mastery increases your healing based on your proximity to your target. So so far really nothing has changed. If you've noticed, if you're looking at the old talents here, I have a little screenshot of the old talents. Same thing here, nothing really changed. Fist of Justice is definitely a good option if you don't want to worry about Repentance, but Repentance is something that I do enjoy using in PvP too. Gives you a little extra cooldown. You'll also see that we're really not going to be judgmenting as much as Holy Paladins, so that is a common theme here. I think that that's a huge change with this. It completely changed my playstyle, in my opinion. So we are no longer based around judgment, especially for raiding. So Fist of Justice is actually a little bit less valuable than it was, because you're not encouraged to judgment as much as you were. So I would probably rock Repentance. Blinding Light definitely has its place for AoE. It does have a 1.5-minute cooldown compared to Repentance on a 15-second cooldown. So I don't know, I would just roll Repentance for the most part. Devotion Aura is pretty much the same. When you are going to use this when you're by yourself, definitely the best thing, because you're just going to get a passive damage reduction. And it says damage dealt to allies within 10 yards is reduced by up to 10%. I believe that's a little bit nerfed. Diminishing as more allies enter it, and then while the aura is active, it goes to 20% on everybody. I would definitely still go with Devotion Aura, especially if you're in a small group or by yourself, like Mythic Plus maybe. Aura Mastery is definitely changed, so we come to our first pretty significant change. So the change is that it says while Aura Mastery is active, 30% of damage is redirected and reduced by 75%. That is completely different than it used to be. It used to, when you popped Aura Mastery, it was mainly used for raiding, which it still is going to be mainly used for raiding when you have a big group. But the main difference now is that you're not having a huge burst of healing. So your Aura of Sacrifice really, it became more of a passive. It used to take a lot of skill, I would say, because you had to line up bursts of healing to splash your healing all over the place. Now you just pop it and you don't even really worry much about it. So Aura of Sacrifice definitely does not take as much skill as it used to. You're not gonna be able to pad the healing meters as far as I know on this. It's just a redirection and reduction of damage. So a little bit disappointed with that, but we'll see how that turns out. I definitely think I'm still going to use Aura of Sacrifice for raiding though, and then the only thing that would give you the healing and not reduction / redirection would be the Aura of Mercy. That's the same pretty much as it was before, just a passive hot kind of on everybody, heal over time. Okay, so now we come down. That was definitely, I would say, your first major change. Then you can see how there's another change here on your 75. So there's no longer Divine Purpose on 75. They actually moved that to 100. So let's talk about what they did here. So you still have Holy Avenger and Holy Prism. They moved Judgment of Light, and they have Awakening where that used to be. So they moved the Judgment of Light here. So you're really forced, in my opinion. Holy Prism has its use, but I have never really liked it. It was an old talent that I never picked anyway. I think it's interesting, but I don't prefer using it. So really the only choice in my mind is between Judgment of Light and Holy Avenger. But I just don't see the Judgment being as useful as it was anymore. And we'll talk briefly about the removal of the artifact abilities. So because of that, I would say we're more bursty healers than we ever really have been. It's not as much about this heal over time stuff that Judgment of Light allowed us to do. So I think that Judgment of Light definitely still has its place, maybe in raiding. But I'm going to go with Holy Avenger probably for the most part. I think Holy Avenger is really hard to beat. It gives you an extra cooldown that is amazing. It increases your haste and your Holy Shock healing, and you'll see in a second your Holy Shock you're going to be using quite a bit because we're going to be able to spec for Divine Purpose. So I'd rock Holy Avenger here, and we're kind of going to stick away from Judgment like I had discussed in my previous guide. So Sanctified Wrath now is there. They got rid of this Fervent Martyr, which I never really used anyway, so that's fine. They added a PvP talent to PvE talents, which is interesting. It's Avenging Crusader. It's allowing you to do damage up close with your Crusader Strike, but also heal some allies around you. It's very, very strong in PvP. Pretty much just allows you to focus on damage and not have to worry too much about healing. It allows you to just dump a bunch of damage in, and the healing is kind of passively happening as you're doing damage because you're healing based on the damage that you do. So I would say that this has its place. Definitely try it out in PvP. Definitely maybe try it out in Mythic Plus, especially if you're going for a timed run or something. Maybe it'll allow you to kind of just focus on doing damage throughout the instance. It does replace your Avenging Wrath, and so I would in general not take this. I would take Sanctified Wrath. That's going to make your wings last 25% longer. It's also going to reduce your Holy Shock cooldown by 50%. So that's still going to increase your damage, at least for single target. It's still going to increase your damage because you're putting out more Holy Shocks if you do choose to do Holy Shocks for damage. But it's also giving you that option of massively increasing your healing output because you're getting more Holy Shocks off. Okay, Awakening, they added this. So Awakening used to be, if you remember, a legendary. It still is technically, but I mean, I guess they're getting rid of these legendaries, right? So we shouldn't become dependent on them anymore. But Awakening used to be the headpiece ability, and it's, like I said, it still kind of is. I'm assuming you could maybe double stack it, and maybe it would be 30%, but I've never really liked it. Okay, and the reason why is it's random. It's a 15% chance to give you Avenging Wrath for 10 seconds, which, yeah, that's great. That you have that, but you can't really choose when you have it. So I found when I use this, a lot of times it procs when I don't really need it. And I just prefer to have the control. As a healer, I think it's pretty nice to have that control if you can, and not have wings popping up randomly. I'd rather have the control of popping wings when I want to, and then having it last longer, and then reducing the cooldown on my Holy Shock. But Awakening may be an interesting choice if you prefer that. So then, last one is Divine Purpose. Major change here. So I always found Divine Purpose an interesting talent. They actually upped it from, I believe, 15% to 20%, so it's increased compared to what it was before. It makes your Holy Shock and your Light of Dawn have a 20% chance to not go on to cooldown, and also make the next cast free. So that's increasing your mana efficiency. It's also allowing you to get more Holy Shocks off, which allows you to get more Infusion of Lights, which allows you to save even more mana with a Holy Light fast cast, for example. It's just really awesome. I would say that for the most part, I'm probably going to go with Divine Purpose for this. You'll notice how they removed Beacon of the Lightbringer. Beacon of the Lightbringer used to be a mastery proximity source. So what I mean by that is you used to be able to put Beacon on somebody and then they acted as you pretty much. And so that was kind of nice because your mastery does increase your heals based on how close you are to people. But now that that's no longer really a thing, this was kind of like the single Beacon talent. You have Beacon of Faith, which was actually reduced in its effectiveness. So it says it's 30% reduced effectiveness now for Beacon of Faith. You're able to do 2, but I believe it used to be 20%. So that's kind of unfortunate. You can put Beacon on 2 people, which is nice for healing tanks. I do think Beacon of Faith is still going to have its place with raiding. I think that putting it on both tanks, and especially on a fight where both like 2 people are consistently taking damage, might be a nice thing to do. So I'm not going to completely say that you shouldn't use Beacon of Faith, because I do think it's nice. But I think that Divine Purpose is pretty strong. I think that you're probably going to go Divine Purpose most of the time. That's my prediction. Beacon of Virtue is also nice. Beacon of Virtue is pretty much unbeatable in terms of being able to burst heal like a party. So if you're in a Mythic Plus situation, or just a party out environment, and you have surrounding allies that are all taking a ton of damage, a ton of burst damage, Beacon of Virtue is amazing. It definitely has its place, but I would say just in general, what you see here in terms of my spec is a good way to do things. Remember, maybe switch Aura of Sacrifice for raiding. I do like Devotion Aura for the most part. So when I'm walking around, these are the talents that I'm using. Another thing I want to go over real quick is these PvP talents, because now they are more talents. They're more relevant talents to than they ever have been to your PvE-er, let's say. So you got your Gladiator's Medallion, and the reason why it's more relevant is because you can enable this war mode, and then you can actually use these talents out in the real world. So they don't just become active when you're flagged for PvP. You seem to be able to use them against like when you're questing and things like that. So definitely a nice thing to think about. So I would go with Gladiator's Medallion, and you can go with something. I mean, I just like having double trinket. So I am a human, so I have every man for himself, but I also have Gladiator's Medallion. I used to PvP a ton. I still do. Not as good as I used to be, but definitely pretty good still. I did get the Arena Master title back in the day and the 2733 achievement. So I can speak from experience on the Holy Paladin for PvP. I do believe that the Gladiator's Medallion choosing when you want to get out of a crowd control is a good way to go. If you prefer more of a passive thing, Adaptation's not bad, and Relentless is not bad either. So Ultimate Sacrifice is amazing. It is like ridiculously good. Okay, now because you're playing Holy, I'm assuming that you're focused on healing other people. You're not as selfish, right? So when you're in an environment that allows you to put Ultimate Sacrifice on another player, this is obviously amazing. It doesn't really help you, but it helps you save other people. it pretty much allows your Blessing of Sacrifice to reduce all the incoming damage. So it's literally, you know, how long? 12 seconds where they're taking no damage and it's all being transferred to you. So it's a little dangerous. You gotta be careful. Realize that, you know, you don't have to heal the person up right away when you use this on them because you're taking all their damage. So definitely, you know, keep an eye on your health. And then this Blessed Hands is the next one. So you can have two. So this kind of combos together. So now you notice how I have 2 charges of Blessing of Freedom, 2 charges of Blessing of Sacrifice. So technically I could have somebody immune to all damage for 24 seconds, which is ridiculous. And then I can also pop, usually I try to pop Divine Protection right after or something like that, or I can do Divine Shield, and then I am just immune to the damage that I'm taking from them. So it's amazing. So definitely look for that. That is really useful. 2 bops, 2 Blessing of Sacrifices, and 2 Blessing of Freedoms. You could put a Blessing of Freedom on yourself and your partner, whatever. That's awesome. Those are very, very, very strong. And then Light's Grace. So these are my preferred PvP talents in general. Divine Favor is nice too. If you're worried about being interrupted, just practice your Fake Cast, and then you can try to avoid that. But you know, that's definitely an option. There's some other options here as well, but just in general, Light's Grace is amazing. So it increases the healing done by your Holy Light by 50%, which pretty much makes your Holy Light stronger than your Flash of Light as long as these talents are active. And it also stacks up to 3 times. So let me just use it real quick on myself. So you see how I have 1 stack. Now I'm going to do it again. Holy Light. 2 stacks, and then I'm going to do Holy Light 3 stacks. So you can keep this on them, and then it's 15% reduced damage, which is quite awesome. So I would definitely go with Light's Grace, and it's also really mana efficient because it encourages you to use your whole Holy Light pretty much every single infusion of light, which means you're healing a lot more efficiently. You really don't have to worry about mana as much. So I think that pretty much covers the talents, both PvP and the PvE talents. I will mention real quick that you do not have your artifact ability anymore, like your artifact ability. So you completely lost your Tears Deliverance, that ability. And then you pretty much lost all of these, and also your relics are pretty useless now. I mean, they do still increase the item level, so just go for item level. Seems like a lot of stuff is still, you know, item level, but remember that, you know, you're not encouraged to use Judgment anymore as much because you're not taking that 12% reduced damage for the next 4 seconds. I really would encourage you to read through. If you're somebody who just experienced going through this update, read through the old stuff just to understand what you actually don't have anymore. So you know, you don't have things that you're used to. You know, one other thing is Aura Mastery, for example, increases all the healing received by party or raid members by 15%. So that's no longer a thing. So when you pop Aura Mastery, that's not happening anymore. So definitely be aware of the things that you do not have anymore. And so let's move on though to gear and legendaries. So I don't think that the gear priority has really changed all that much. I will focus on a couple of the major things. You're still going to want crit. Notice how your Holy Shock has an additional 30% chance to crit. So it's kind of a pain because I used to have 50% crit, and then I used to, you know, have the crit chance doubled. So that's how it used to work. And so I used to have like 100% chance to crit with my Holy Shock all the time, every time. This obviously still crits a lot because it's, you know, 72% chance to crit, but it's not as, you know, it's not as guaranteed. So a little bit more RNG involved. So you're still going to want crit. Crit is still very, very, very important. I would say definitely try to have above 40% crit. I went through my gear and redid it a little bit. I was able to get myself up to 42% crit. Anything over, you know, 40 or above right now, I'd say is pretty good. But definitely want to focus on your crit. get that as high as you can. The other ones are not as big of a deal. I would say Mastery is probably still your number 2. Mastery and Versatility. Haste is still not as big of a deal for us because we are casting, but not as much. So if you have some haste, great, but I'd say Mastery and Verse is nice. Mastery is going to increase your healing based on your proximity, and Versatility is just going to straight out increase your healing and damage. Let's talk about, so you're going to want to look for crit on all your gear. In terms of the Antorus set, you can take a look at the set bonuses, especially when the new gear starts coming out, the new raids and stuff like that. You're going to want to be mindful of that. So right now I'm still rocking the 4 set of Antorus, but the main idea is focus on item level, focus on crit especially. And then the Legendaries is an interesting conversation real quick. So the ring is no longer the best, I don't think. So in my opinion, the ring is still okay. And what I mean by the ring is the crown jewel, which pretty much was amazing for everybody all the time. That's because you were encouraged to use your judgment. I just think that you can still do that, especially if you go Judgment of Light with your talents. And you could still, get away with doing that. I do think that you could probably make it work, but because you're no longer getting the damage reduction from judgmenting, it is still nice to throw those judgments out, but we're still not as encouraged to do so. So personally, because I chose a Holy Avenger, I'm going to go with the style of healing that does not use this legendary, the Crown Jewel. So I'm more towards the Burst Avenging Wrath style of healing, and so that I'm going to wear Chain of Thrain for most likely. I'm still experimenting with it, but definitely a very powerful legendary considering that you're going to go Sanctified Wrath and Holy Avenger. If you go that route and you also have Divine Purpose, you're going to get more Holy Shocks off. They're going to be extremely powerful. So your Avenging Wrath is just an amazing cooldown if you switch that out for Chain of Thrain, and it also gives you that extra damage too. So for single target damage, this spec I think is pretty nice. I'd say we're in really good shape for being able to do like a Shakadin style, gameplay where we can actually do quite a bit of single target damage now that we can have Divine Purpose and wear Chain of Thrain legitimately and stuff like that. And then obviously Pride Ez is a really good choice, so I'm going to rock those two. The other legendaries definitely have their places in certain scenarios, but as of now I think these are my top 2. And like I said, the other legendaries, I might throw them on in certain situations, but I'm just trying to give you an in general opinion. Alrighty, so now we're done with gear and legendaries. Let's move on to add-ons, keybinds, and macros. Remember that the whole purpose, in my opinion, of add-ons, keybinds, and macros is just to allow you to better access the game, to be able to control your character better, to be able to make better decisions on the fly. It's really just all about improving your gameplay in real time. So that is how I am focused with my mindset around this. So my add-ons, I would say the main ones would be Z-Pearl, that's my unit frames, and then Bartender 4 is the way that I do my keybinds and abilities. I can move my bars and make them whatever size I want. Those would be, I would say, the main 2. Obviously you're going to want some damage meters so you can get some real-time data on damage, healing, damage taken, the spells that you're doing, things like that. Especially an after-action type report where you can kind of investigate and see what you're doing, how, what happened during that fight, or at the end of a dungeon, or at the end of a raid, or end of an arena, or whatever. Then you can have some other things too. But I would say those are the main ones to focus on. There's an interesting macro that I've been using to make my life a little easier for Bestow Faith. I'll mention it real quick. I'm still testing it out. It honestly just it's a pretty simple one. All right, it's just for Bestow Faith. It just pretty much allows me to every time I cast Bestow Faith, it actually always goes on me. Now you can also get around this by going to your interface and going to let's see, the game and combat, and then you'll see that a self-cast key, you can set it up so that you auto, well, this is auto self-cast, but you can set it up so that you can hold a modifier key like Alt, and then or a focus, you know, for your focus target, and while you're holding that modifier, anything that you press will automatically go on that person. But I've tried to use that, I can't get used to it. I think that would probably be the better thing to do, but I've just found that most of the time, over 90% of the time, I use Bestow Faith on myself anyway. So just to make my life easier, I macroed it so that it is always on myself. So you know that some people could disagree with that, but I'm just throwing that out there. You might want to do that, especially when you're first learning how to use this ability. It just makes your life a little easier because you can be targeting somebody else and then you can throw it on yourself. Or like I said, do that modifier key. It just allows you to cast abilities on yourself too. And if you did that modifier, you can also do the same thing with Holy Shock too, which I think is the better thing to do, because then as you're targeting somebody else, you can just instantly self-cast Holy Shock on yourself if you need to. So just, you know, little tips and tricks for targeting and macro type stuff, just to make your life easier. Remember, that's the whole point. So I would say that that's pretty much it for the macros and the add-ons. I would say that when you do keybind your abilities, make sure that you do it in a way that allows you to play with fluid. You don't really have to think about what you're doing. I mean, your abilities are in a location that makes sense. For example, I have Holy Shock and Light of Dawn right next to each other because they're both instant cast and they're both, you know, about 8-10 second cooldown. And then I have Flash of Light and Holy Light right next to each other. You know, one of them's 2 and one of them's Shift 2. I have a 12-button mouse that I have a lot of these keybinds on. Then I have my two damaging abilities, Crusader Strike and Consecration, next to each other. I have my 2 instant cast interesting abilities next to each other, Light of the Martyr and Bestow Faith. I got my Hammer of Justice and my Hand of Reckoning right next to each other. I got my Judgment, and then I got my Rule of Law right there. Then I have a lot of my cooldowns that I pop right together here. My 2 defensives are on the same keybind with E. My Avenging Wrath and Holy Avenger are on the same keybind with a shift modifier. My Aura Mastery is on X. You know, just pretty much set up your keybinds so that you don't actually have to click and you can focus on what you're doing so that you can make better decisions in your environment rather than focus on what you're clicking. Definitely set something up so you can do that efficiently. And you can kind of see the rest here. Just the general message here is just make sure that your keybinds make sense to you, and also, in my opinion, make sure that these keybinds are consistent across all 3 specs if you play all 3 specs. So that's another reason why I set this up to be how I have it, because when I switch specs, it's very consistent across all 3 specs. Another mod that you want to potentially use is Weak Auras. So if you download it, you'll be able to do /WA. And that's going to be able to help you with cooldown feedback. I think that's pretty much the main thing that this does for you, especially sound feedback. In my opinion, that's what I use this for mostly. You can set it up so that there's bars that monitor your cooldowns as well. But you'll be able to get things like, for example, if I Holy Shock, my Holy Shock goes on the cooldown. When it comes off of cooldown, you'll hear a gunshot noise. And so, boom, I hear that gunshot, and it pretty much rewires my brain like Pavlov's dogs. You know, when the dogs started salivating even though there wasn't food. So pretty much when you hear that noise, your brain will be programmed to, hey, it's time to Holy Shock. And eventually you won't even hear the sounds anymore. Your subconscious handles that, and so it frees up your consciousness to you know, to make better decisions. So I think that's a worthwhile add-on for sure. Get some sound feedback for your cooldowns. Another thing I use it for is raid cooldowns, so I can monitor the cooldowns of the people in my raid or party or whatever. So definitely look into Weak Auras, a very helpful add-on. Alright, so let's move on to Playstyle and Abilities. you'll notice that it's not really that different. I'd say that the current way that I'm playing, Judgment is not as important as it was. And so what you'll be doing is still prioritizing Holy Shock every time that it's up. So I can Holy Shock. Remember, you're going to get Infusion of Light every time it crits, which usually it's going to crit. For me, it's like a 72% chance to crit. It's no longer going to be a guaranteed thing like it pretty much used to be, but it's still a very, very important aspect of a Holy Paladin. And so make sure that you're aware of, you know, what that looks like whenever you have Infusion of Light. And you have to make a choice. Are you going to use Holy Light or are you going to use Flash of Light? Holy Light, especially with those PvP talents activated, with the Light's Grace, you're almost always going to choose Holy Light. Now, if you don't have your PvP talents activated, then it's more of a choice. You are going to have to choose between a Flash of Light, which is going to heal more, and a Holy Light, which is going to be more mana efficient. So it's just a choice that's up to you. Try to avoid using Flash of Light and spamming it, because that is the more mana cost ability, and if you find yourself running out of mana, it's probably because you're spamming Flash of Light too much. Try to use other heals. So that kind of covers Holy Shock. Also, though, remember that if you spec for Divine Purpose, not only are you looking for this symbol, which indicates that you have Infusion of Light, you're also looking for this symbol on the top, which is a 20% chance to happen, making the next one free. So I'm going to get rid of my infusion first, and then I'm going to cast another one. See how I have another infusion? Get rid of that infusion, then I'm going to cast another one. Look at that, I got another infusion. Notice how I didn't waste my Infusion of Light. So when you get the proc on the top, the Divine Purpose, and you also have a Infusion of Light, try to use the Infusion of Light first. That way, when you go ahead and use your next Holy Shock and you get an additional Infusion of Light, it's not going to put the first one to waste. So that is how I would manage those two procs, and it's going to be happening all the time. So I'd say that's really the core of healing on a Paladin right now, is managing the Infusion of Light, but also the Divine Purpose procs if you're spec'd that way. Also, your beacon, you, like I was saying before, you know, Beacon of Virtue has its place, and Beacon of Faith also has its place for the double tank healing, even though it's 30% reduced effectiveness instead of, I believe, 20 like it used to. Divine Purpose is going to be, I think, my general choice. It's 20% instead of 15%. It's helps you with your mana efficiency. I just think it's all around makes for some interesting gameplay, and so. What I would recommend then, you're still going to have your Beacon of Light. I would recommend putting it, there's really two options. One is you only have one, so I would put it on yourself. Really the advantage to putting it on yourself is you can heal other people and not really have to worry about your health. And so you can spam, for example, Light of the Martyr. Let me get, you know, some Light of the Martyrs off. I'm going to break through my shield, my Pride Edge shield. Alright, and so I'm through it, and then all of a sudden I'm going to cast a Holy Shock, and then it's healing me. Watch, so I'm just going to heal. I didn't heal myself right there. I just healed, you know, that commander, and I ended up going back to full health. So that's the main advantage, is that you can really, you know, use Light of the Martyr and be, you know, taking damage. Let's say if you're using Aura of Sacrifice as well, you can be taking on a bunch of damage, but not have to worry about dying as much. So I would say, in general, if you just want to keep your life easy, throw Beacon of Light on yourself, and it does help you out. It also, it says targeting this ally directly with Flash of Light or Holy Light also refunds 25% of the mana spent on those heals. So even if you're out and about in the real world, you should definitely have it on yourself, you know, doing quests or whatever, because when you heal yourself, you're going to get mana back. And so that's definitely an interesting way to use Beacon of Light, I think. The other way to use it would be to choose to use it on a target far away from you, or just a tank, somebody that you know is going to be taking more damage. But even, you know, if you wanted to use it on a target far away from you, what that would allow you to do, I'm just kind of giving you an idea here, is take advantage of your mastery. Because your mastery is going to increase it based on how close you are. So let me put it on this. Let me put it on this guy. commander here. So if I'm healing myself, you can watch how it's also going to heal her, right? I'm going to heal myself. It's also going to heal her. And she's going to take, no matter where I am, so let's do it again. So I'm pretty far away from her right now. And 4,200 something, non-crit. If I go close, it's supposed to heal her more, right? Still going to do, you know, 4,200 something. So really what this allows you to do is heal yourself or somebody else, and allow you to take it somebody else that's close to you. And then if your beacon target is far away from you, it allows them to take advantage of that mastery a little bit better than if you were to just heal far away and then have beacon on yourself. So the way that you're going to use Bestow Faith and Light of the Martyr is they're both instant cast heals. You're most likely going to use them when your Holy Shock is on cooldown and you have a little bit of downtime. Whenever I, like over 90% of the time, use Bestow Faith on myself, I can pretty easily predict when I'm going to be taking damage compared to when somebody else is going to be taking damage, especially when I know when I'm using Light of the Martyr, which is taking health away from me. So it's easier, in my opinion, to time Bestow Faith on yourself, make maximum use out of that with your mastery and everything. So I will use Bestow Faith on myself and right before I'm taking damage or before I'm spamming Light of the Martyr. And Light of the Martyr you're going to use as a nice instant cast. Just be aware of your health when somebody's about to die. You know, let's say they're at, I mean, you don't have to do this, but let's just, one scenario would be if somebody's at like 5% health and you have really no other instant cast options. What are you going to do? Are you going to start your cast on a Flash of Light? No, you're going to, because they might be dead before that cast is done. You're going to most likely do a Light of the Martyr, get them topped up a little bit, and then start casting again, or until your Holy Shock is ready to go again. And then the other way to use Light of the Martyr is just, you know, to break through your Pride Edge shield, or just, you know, just to top people off. If somebody's at like 80% or whatever, it's just a nice instant cast, low mana cost heal. So this is, you know, both of these are really good on mana, so Light of the Martyr and Bestow Faith. So make sure you're using both of those effectively. And then that pretty much wraps up how you're going to heal. I mean, you do also have your blessings. You have your Blessing of Freedom, which obviously you're going to use if somebody has moving and pairing effects. A lot of times it'll remove a particular ability that in PvE or PvP, and you know, you just want to be aware of what Blessing of Freedom is able to remove. And then you can go over to Blessing of Sacrifice. Definitely use this as a cooldown. It is a 2-minute cooldown, so this kind of gets into how we're going to use our cooldowns. So definitely don't just use this randomly. You do have 2 charges if you have your PvP abilities activated, and remember you also have that ultimate sacrifice as well if you have your PvP talents activated. So be aware of when those are active and when those are not. But very strong cooldown with or without the PvP talents. It's going to transfer damage to you. Just be aware that you're going to be taking extra damage, and that would be a good time to pop Divine Protection or even your Divine Shield. And so more cooldowns. We're kind of getting into cooldowns now. Is an interesting cooldown, Lay on Hands. It is 10 minutes though, so really, you know, use that as a last resort. Lay on Hands is just, you know, one of those cooldowns that you're not really going to have up a lot. So I mean, yes, if you have it up and use it. I mean, don't, you know, if you're never using Lay on Hands, then you're doing it wrong. But make sure that you're using it at an appropriate time, because it's not like you can just use this all the time. And so these are really your main 3 cooldowns, I would say, though. So you got your Holy Avenger if you spec for it, which in my opinion you probably should. That's going to really buff your Holy Shock, which is kind of the core to a Holy Paladin. And it's also going to give you extra haste to get those infusion casts off quicker. And then you have Avenging Wrath, another cooldown of yours. That's probably the strongest. It definitely is the strongest if you have Sanctified Wrath. It is going to, and also if you have the Legendary Belt, it's a major cooldown. So When you have Avenging Wrath up, make sure you don't pop it unless you really need it, and then when it's up, make sure you're really managing your procs and using your Holy Shock Infusion of Light stuff really effectively, making quick, good decisions. And then Aura Mastery depends on the aura that you're using. You just got to make sure that you know what is doing what. Remember the Aura of Sacrifice, it's not about burst healing anymore. It's just more of a passive thing. So in terms of preventing damage from happening, / transferring it to you, your Aura of Sacrifice and your Devotion Aura are going to be the go-to ones. I'd say Devotion Aura for a very small group, especially if you're by yourself. And then once you start to get more people, like a big raid or something, I would probably switch to Aura of Sacrifice. Aura of Mercy also has its place, potentially. It's just a small little heal that goes on everybody. Just be aware of what's happening for 8 seconds when you pop Aura Masteries. That's a nice cooldown as well. So that kind of goes over the cooldowns. Really, one other thing real quick is you do have potions and buffs and stuff, so make sure you're doing that. Eat some crit food, eat a feast, drink a flask or whatever, and do your pre-pot too, like Potion of Prolonged Power, whatever it might be, mana potions, stuff like that. Be aware of the buff stuff that you can do to yourself. Another example would be the Repurposed Spell Focuser, would be an example of like a free flask that you can have, or like this Augment Rune, just stuff like that where you can just have free buffs, and you might as well make sure that you're making use of that. It's just something that a lot of people forget about. Remember, Lay Torrent at the moment is the one that you use if you have 10 seconds to spare, and then Ancient Mana Potion is the one that you use if you don't really have any downtime and you just need mana instantly. So in the middle of a fight, and then you can pre-pot with Potion of Prolonged Power. So the last thing that we have to go over is how to do damage, and this did change significantly enough to talk about it. So Holy Paladins, I do think, are pretty strong still in terms of their damage capabilities, especially on single target, but you have to talk about what changed here. So when you use Judgment now, it goes on there for 14 seconds. It just disappeared because I think I left combat, but it goes on there, and the problem is it gets consumed, so it's a consumable thing now. And so if I use Crusader Strike or Holy Shock, I have to choose between the two. So I'm going to get it on there again, and notice how when I use my ability, it goes off. And you can read it too. So let's figure out which one we're going to choose real quick. We'll do some science. Okay. So let's use a Holy Shock. It crits for like 2,800. Okay, and then we're going to use a Crusader Strike. Let's see what that crits for. 886. So let's see. Just to completely unbuff. So 1,772. So just from that, you know that you're going to use Holy Shock. But the other reason also that tops it off is that your Holy Shock has an additional 30% chance to crit. So without a doubt, from what you just saw, you probably are convinced, okay, well, Holy Shock is what I'm going to want to use to consume my Judgment. All right. So what you're going to do then when you go in is, if you want maximum burst, you're probably going to want to do Avenging Wrath and Holy Avenger at the same time. Or you could do one and then the other. Especially, it's a little inconvenient now that there's global cooldowns involved in both of them. Definitely spread your cooldowns out. Don't use everything at the same time. But just as an example, before your Judgment hits, you probably want to have Avenging Wrath up, right? Because that's going to increase your damage. So the first thing you'd probably do is Avenging Wrath before you do anything. Or maybe even pre-pot or whatever, right? And then you're going to do Avenging Wrath, and so that's going to trigger a global cooldown. Then if you wanted to, you could do a Judgment, but you might also want to do Holy Avenger too. Just get them both on, and then you don't have to worry about it. So get both of those on, do your Judgment, and then the first thing you're going to want to do after your Judgment is Holy Shock. All right, and then after that, you're going to want a Crusader Strike, because if you're spec for a Crusader's Might, which you should be for damage, your first Crusader Strike is going to reduce the cooldown of your Holy Shock and Light of Dawn, but mainly Holy Shock is what you're worried about. So if you have your Judgment, then you take advantage of the buff from the Judgment by using Holy Shock. Your Holy Shock's now on cooldown. It's also a reduced cooldown because you have Avenging Wrath up. But then you pretty much are eliminating the cooldown by doing a Crusader Strike. And then you just alternate between Holy Shock and Crusader Strike. Every single time you have Judgment up, you're going to use it and then follow it up with a Holy Shock right afterwards. Right? And then the other thing you want to worry about is using Consecration, especially for AoE, when you have some downtime, so as a filler. Right? So priority is going to be Judgment and Holy Shock, and as a filler you're using Crusader Strike and Consecration. That's one way to think about it. So let's get started here. So I'm just going to start, I'm not going to use a pre-pop, but we'll start with Avenging Wrath and Holy Avenger, and then I'll get started. Okay, I'm going to Judgment. Right after I'm going to use a Holy Shock, Crusader Strike, Holy Shock, Crusader Strike, Holy Shock, Crusader Strike, Holy Shock, and then I'm going to use my Judgment, Holy Shock, Crusader Strike. So you can kind of see how I am doing this. And then I can throw in a Consecrate if I want to, just as a filler, because I had a little bit of downtime there. Just manage your cooldowns here. I had a little downtime there. So then it's going to get a lot slower once your wings goes off. It's going to get a lot slower. So then it slows down. You don't have to be frantically pressing buttons. But remember, every time you Judgment, you follow it up with a Holy Shock. So that is how you do damage, in my opinion. I would definitely make sure that you practice that and that you're doing damage, especially in a raid or an instance or whatever. If you don't have anything else to do, why not? Just throw some damage out there. And so hopefully you enjoyed this guide and you better understand the update for this pre-patch for Battle of Azeroth. And I will be doing another guide at some point when the Battle for Azeroth actually comes out and I get a little bit of the raiding and dungeons and I gain more experience with the new armor that's coming out and everything. So be on the lookout for that. But a lot of people have been requesting a update for this new pre-patch thing. So here it is, and hopefully you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.